Glad you're here. Beautiful morning. We have great content. But before we get to that, I'd like to thank Ian and Steve for hosting us here this morning. It's been a few years since they've hosted us, so thank you for that. And also like to thank our sponsors, our EDU sponsors. EDU stands for educational. We're actually going to hear from two of our advisor sponsors today, Ian and Steve Staugaitis. And also we have Kevin Fox is here. He's actually a sibling partnership sponsor from Capstone. They do employee benefits and P&C. Also want to introduce my team members who are here. We got Henry, who's going to be speaking in a little bit. Brenda, you've been getting emails from her. And we have Joy Sawatsky in the last row. She is our newest advisor. And we just had great fun. We were all at the Iron Pigs with our families on Friday night. They didn't win, but they did have 5 home runs, and my granddaughter did get to throw one of the opening pitches. So it was pretty awesome.
I got a baseball.
And that's right, you got a baseball, and pretty cool. So today we are going to be, actually our theme is building capacity in all the 5 mountains. And the mountain that we're going to be focusing on today is the ownership, the shareholder mountain, the gold mountain. We focused on that 2 weeks ago. We talked about capital allocation. We focused on it earlier in the year when we had the Hershen family talk about their experiences. And today we're going to be talking about ownership transitions. So you're all in a different spot with transitions. I'd like to just note that some of you in here are founders or G1. So we have, let's see, we have Ruben, G1 and son back there. We have Nita and Dean, G1, Mary Beth and her daughter Amy, and let's see, am I missing anyone? And John. John is here as well. So G1s, yes. Then we got some G2s. We have Charlie here, Otterbein Barebow, and son CW. And we have a bunch of G3s. We have Rob Zaritsky from Parkway. We have Chuck and his sister Laurie, and Chuck's son-in-law, Alex, here from Huber in Lancaster. And we have, let's see, there's another G3. Maybe not. We maybe jump right then to G5. We have Randall and Ryan in the back from Stauffer Glove and Safety. Did I get everybody? Okay, so there's a lot going on here. And so today we want to focus on preparing for ownership transitions. We're going to be talking about temptations and principles. So we're going to hear from Ian. If Ian, you want to just stand up. Ian is the founder and his team here. It's a great team. What I always say about Ian and the team is they really make financial planning a lot of fun. And in fact, it's so much fun that he's now my personal financial planner in our family. But not just fun, they're really good. They have really a financial concierge service here. And then we're going to hear from Steve Staugaitis. And Steve here is a partner with Kreischer Miller. And Steve was just telling me he picked up his daughter, she's 16, and his mother, they just came back from Italy yesterday. So it's like a tradition they have in their family. But Steve works with entrepreneurs and family businesses, and he'll be talking about transfer methods and structures and really what the business can afford. And Henry's going to kick us off. Henry's the founder. You know about Henry. He is going to start off with the purpose, why we're here. And just an FYI, Henry just had some eye surgery. He looks great. But if you see the little pink eye, it's not red eye, it's not pink eye. It's not contagious. Just want you to know that. And if anybody wants paper, raise your hand. We'll give you a tablet, but we can send you the slides. Just send an email out to us, and we'll send you the slides if you want. And we'll end our time with some conversation, comments, and any questions. And then you can be on your way by 10:30. Sound good?
Okay, thank
all
you.
right, Henry.
Thank you, Sally. First of all, I want to acknowledge all the people in here from whom I've learned. Over the last 33 years, it's been my privilege to work with many different companies, mostly in the Delaware Valley, but also in Florida and Ohio and other places. But I think I've learned more from my clients than they have learned from me. So I'm glad to have you all here. Chuck and Laurie, We've had a long relationship with you guys, and Rod and Alex, glad to see you here. I want to note that we're going to talk about some of the temptations involved in transition, and we're also then going to talk about principles. Now, the reason we're talking about principles is because every family business is different. And maybe even some of these principles don't fully apply to you, okay? But it's a way of talking about this complex thing called transition. So there are three things we want to do today. We want to talk briefly about the temptations that could sabotage a really healthy transition. Our hope is that the transition itself will make your family and your business stronger. It's not something to get through. It's something to enjoy the ride and actually improve all the 5 mountains, okay? It's not primarily a financial transaction, okay? Now, the legal transaction, the financial planning, all very important, but it's really the relationships that are the things that vibrate a lot. So we're going to talk about some of the temptations and some of the things that we've seen, and I want you to kind of chime in on that, the other presenters, but any of you, about some of the temptations that you may face. And then we're going to talk about the 5 principles to guide your process. And then lastly, about how to leverage professional advisors. Now, that's like herding cats, okay? I mean, you know, like, so there's what we want to show you is, and demonstrate and talk about, is how professional advisors really can help you to build a much more solid foundation for the future of your business, okay? Now, the first temptation is what I call conflating. You know, like Sally taught me this. Sally is much smarter than me, and her vocabulary is much broader than mine as well. What does conflating mean? And Sally, you be the judge. What does conflating mean?
No one's Googling?
Bringing together
Okay.
two separate concepts, ideas.
Okay. All right. What do you think? Ian? Combining. Okay. Sally?
Yes, absolutely.
Okay.
Both, yep.
Well, actually,
It is one.
yeah, and they are not one. Okay? They are very important. Like we think here about estate planning is very important, right? So that's something parents do, right? And shareholder transitions or ownership transition, we tend to use the term shareholder because most of the transitions in family business are 1 to 3 or 2 to 6. So it gets more and more, this part becomes more and more complicated. So who's in charge of estate planning? Now, Ruben, you have an estate plan, right?
Maybe.
Okay, now, you know, we believe estate planning is very important, but who makes the decisions in estate planning?
You do.
Okay, the parents, right?
Each individual.
Each individual, okay. So we think it's important that you share your estate plan with your children so they know what's coming up. We recommend that very strongly, but it's really not a 2-generation process. It's kind of my decision. We have an estate plan, and our kids know what's going to happen in the possibility that I will die. I mean, it's not going to happen, or at least not soon, I hope. But they really, it's not their decision. Now let's talk here a little bit about shareholder transition. Who's in charge of that?
Majority shareholder.
Okay. Why?
can make the call.
Okay. Okay, we see ownership transition as really a process of peers, of generations, both kind of equal in planning. Now, the final responsibility is the majority shareholder, right? But we think it's important that the junior generation not be a passive receiver of the ownership responsibilities. Okay? So we think it's very important that the juniors step up and really demonstrate that they are capable of being owners, where that is not so true here. Now, you want to be careful about how much money you give kids as well, but it's not nearly the kind of complexity that we face here. Now, the second temptation has to do with timing. Some people start too late. Some people rush through it too fast, and some do it very much like December 27, maybe, because the tax law is going to change. Did you know that the tax laws are going to change? Have the tax laws ever not changed? You know, it's always in transition in some way. Anybody else need a pad? Gee whiz, I'm impressed, CW. So starting too late. We had one client family who came to us and said, well, our father, and actually was the grandson, he was 93 and he hadn't transferred the business. And it ended up destroying the business. We have other clients where they actually started early and they were in a pretty intensive conversation with one advisor for about 15 years, but they never finished it. At least they didn't finish it well, and the father got cancer, and the business was transferred to the kids, and the kids signed documents they didn't really know they were signing. They were not at all prepared. So transitions are not an event, it's a long-term process. You can give stock in the 11th hour, but we do not recommend business go that way. The third temptation is the rosy glow of the parental lens. Now, I'm missing a lens here today, but all of us as parents, we really would like our kids to do well, and sometimes we underestimate them, sometimes we overestimate them. Did any of you have a Wang computer? Never heard of Wang computer? Pardon, you did?
I've heard of them.
You heard of them? Okay. Do you know what happened to them?
Apple.
Well, actually, Dr. Chen, who was a Chinese American, who was very smart, had the first. Ian, was it a word processing? I mean, Ian knows about this. Can you say a little bit about it?
Not as much as you would like me to be able to tell you about it, but yeah, I mean, Dr. Chen started Wang, and it was the greatest thing ever. But the problem is that no one really knew about it, and it got screwed up because of what Henry's going to tell you. But it could have been. I don't have much to say anyway. But yeah, then Apple, Bill Gates, and everybody else came. So that's who we all know, right? So
Well, he had a son, and his advisors said, "We don't think your son can do this." And he said, "He's my son. He can do it." Well, you do not. That company you don't know today, because the son was unable. He probably was willing, but he was unable to give the leadership. So it's really important to really be objective about what our children can assume. Starting a business is very difficult. I've done it. Many of you are founders, but assuming the responsibility for a business is also a big responsibility, and not everybody can do it. So we think it's a real serious question is to say, do my kids have what it takes? And the last one here is that I will take care of it. And we've seen this happen a lot. Mom and dad, they kind of have estate planning meetings and they have business transition meetings, and then they announce it to the kids. And we think of shareholdership as a business marriage. Now, these same parents who would never be allowed by the junior generation, the rising generation, to arrange the business, they wouldn't have let them control who they're going to get married. Actually, some of our clients, we have one where there were two marriages that were arranged by the parents, and they worked out really well. But a business marriage, we think, takes both generations, and really we would put most of the responsibility on the next generation. So let's talk a little bit about the pace of change here. On these mountains, which of these mountains faces the most change, would you say? Advisor? Management? Okay.
Marriage, family.
Okay.
Family, changing.
It's changing all the time,
Processes.
right? I mean, everybody's growing,
Yes.
right? But I would kind of lean toward management, being because your customer's changing and you're always changing. But the family is also pretty important. Advisors, my experience with advisors is that people don't change advisors enough. That we start with somebody and we stay with them even though we're not sure whether they're doing the job that we need, but we're loyal, right? They almost become part of the family. The board, I even find that with boards that, when you finally get people to install a board, they often don't change enough. What about the shareholder piece? How often do you change shareholders? About once a generation, right? So it's a fairly big deal, and ironically, it's the most important mountain, right? Often there's discussion about who will be president, but ultimately, the power and control, authority, the responsibility lies here. So even though it's the most stable mountain, we don't have a lot of experience working through change, and there's often a lot of anxiety about, well, who's going to lead, that is in management, but who's going to lead this group, and who's going to be involved? Is everybody going to be in the loop here? How do we determine who's going to be involved? In estate planning, in most cases, everybody's involved in some way. But in ownership planning, we think it's pretty important to think through the competence of each person, the compatibility of each person, and the alignment of each person. About 15 years ago, we worked with a family with their 4 brothers, all of who entered a process of discussing transition. And about 3/4 of the way through the discussion, one of the brothers raised his hand and he said, I don't think I want to do this. So they had to make arrangements for him. He got money, he didn't get stock. And I thought it was pretty brave of him to kind of step aside and say, no, this is not my deal. And then how do we proceed? Who's in charge?
Well, and I would add, who has control? like who's in charge. There's a lot with that because there's a lot of control there.
Yeah. So this is supposed to shake. Well, it's not shaking too much, but so when you're messing here, you're really impacting all the mountains, okay? Because you're changing. If you're in a sibling, the sibling partnership is probably, in our observation, the most difficult move, because there's stuff going on in siblings that siblings aren't even aware of. And so when you start talking about this, even if I'm not an owner, like Ruben in your case, some of your children will likely not be owners, but they have a huge stake in what you do with ownership because they are emotional owners of the business, right? We find this, the most extreme example of this is a farm. Really hard to transition farms because I grew up there. It's my business, even though I don't own it. I don't really want to own it, but it's really important how this plays out. So there's a lot of anxiety here. And what happens in the face of anxiety? Anxiety goes up. What comes down?
Trust.
Trust. Relationships, okay. Logic. That's the answer I want. Really, there's a relationship here between anxiety and the use of the prefrontal cortex.
It's overflooded.
Yeah, when we, and there's a lot of stuff going on here that isn't financial, it's not legal. It's kind of where do I belong and am I important within the family system? And so people get anxious and they really don't have the capacity to work logically through the process. So how do we lower anxiety? Well, I think that's what you're doing here today. You're trying to understand the complexity of ahead, hanging around peers, all right, this group, who are ahead of you, or maybe in the same situation, reading seminars, blogs, podcasts. So you're learning about transition. We talked with a rising generation person recently who had a business degree from a very good university where they have a major in the particular area that this business is in. And I said, well, what did you learn about family business? Oh, we never talked about that. Okay. So business education is important throughout the life cycle, not just at the front end. But learning about family business transition and relationships is really important. The other thing that we think can lower anxiety is to identify and test potential professional advisors before you need them. We had a meeting at Lincoln Investment, a month or so ago, and we were talking about family problems. Okay, all of our families have problems, right? And if you don't have a therapist before you have a problem, you're in trouble. Because right now it's hard to get to see a therapist. So, like, kind of figuring out who am I gonna need in the future as we move through this complexity. So I'm preaching to the choir here in a way, because if you're a member of the family business learning community, and many of you have been for years, you're continuing to understand this. Now, the second area that we think is important is get grounded in the 5 principles, which is going to be the core of our presentation today, and begin to assemble a team when you finally come around to, you're moving directly into the transition, which some of you are, is to have, this is a once in a lifetime process. You only get one shot at this. So the stakes are pretty high. So you have a copy of the 5 principles Does everybody have one? The first principle is the rising generation steps up, invests, and proposes. Now, this is a little weird, okay? Like if you go to most family business advisors or most attorneys or accountants, they're going to talk to the seniors. Now, of course, the seniors need to be involved, and that's number two, but we're really talking about the leadership of the next generation. That is what is going to make this business succeed or fail. And so this process of the rising generation stepping up, and it means stepping up by growing up, first of all, okay, to developing a solid sense of self and to develop strong marriages. Rita's a therapist here, so marriage is a good laboratory to learn communication and conflict resolution and all the stuff that we have everywhere else that we move. So investing in education, but we also take it a little further, is that the rising gen actually takes the lead in ownership transition. In other words, they need to get themselves, we think, into a preferred buyer position. Okay? You can sell your company to anybody. Now, most of us who come here are interested in it going to the next generation. But we believe the rising gen should have to approve that they can handle this. Val, you want to add anything?
Yeah, and I would add sometimes it's hard for the rising gen to understand who they are. You know, being in a family business, it seems like it's harder to grow up. So learning how to be a solid self, learning how to differentiate. There's so much togetherness in family. And so that's a whole process. So for them to do that often takes some outside counsel and coaches and mentors, and for them to come up with their own goals and their own vision, and that's some of the work that we help them with. But then actually, and learning how to craft proposals. So it is a mindset, but we think that's a really important, and it's different. Like if you're at a younger stage, some of you have kids that are younger, it's encouraging that stepping out almost.
And we can take your challenges on any of these. Now, as we get closer to the actual shift of ownership, we think we need something a lot bigger than a buy-sell or a shareholder agreement. We think it's important that the next generation develop a shareholder covenant. Now, what's the difference between a covenant and a contract? Your buy-sell is a contract. But what's a covenant? It's a promise. It's a personal commitment. It's deeper than a contract. Okay, so it's a familial term that really is a written document which talks about, what is our shared dream? Now, I grew up in a family business, and my two older brothers had a shared dream, but my dream was different. But we find too many rising generation members who are partners or shareholders who really don't want to be shareholders, but they don't know if they can belong in the family properly if they're not shareholders. And then they also need to agree on shareholder policies, which includes the buy-sell. But as they move through this, they need to be testing their own competence. I mean, CW, you got to be better than your dad, right? Think that's possible?
Absolutely.
Okay. Like if you can't be better than your parents, I don't think you're going to do well.
And sometimes actually you get caught up, the next generation gets caught up in their dad's or their mom's or the founder's dream. It's really hard to differentiate their dream from the founder's dream.
And the second thing is commitment. Like, are you really committed to the business? Now, CW, I think you're pretty committed, right? Now, alignment is the third one. Like you have like 3 or 4, right? Possible shareholders who are already working in the business. Now, are we aligned? Now, it's kind of hard to tell people you're already in the business with that I don't think you and I are aligned, right? I mean, that's a lot of candor and clarity and honesty. And if you know mom and dad really want us to be partners, it's kind of hard to develop a strong sense of self. So, what's the role of the seniors in this? Well, if they're not going to do it all, what do they do? Well, we think the first thing to do is to determine the number. Owners aren't going to do anything until they are very, very confident that they will have the financial foundation for the rest of their life. So I'm not going to help them find the number, but we know somebody who can help them very well with that, and that is Ian. So I'm going to defer to Ian here.
Thanks, Henry. Just because I don't know the crowd like he does, how many founding generations do we have here? And then, regardless of age, how many second generation? Your third? Awesome. Really cool.
And fifth, or and fourth.
Awesome. So, listen, how many children do you have, sir?
2.
Really 3, right? The business? I mean, it's a child. It's what it is. So we want to protect our child. We're concerned about our child. We want to make sure our child not exists, but goes out in the world and flourishes, right? And that's really what a lot of this process is about when you're the letting go member. But then you have the next generation that's saying, hey, I'm confused, I'm anxious, I'm all these things which we already touched on, we're going to get more deep into. But without having this piece of it, and we help all generations, by the way, in our business, but for today, I'm tasked with just talking about the letting go member and seeing what that looks like. If this piece isn't right, in my opinion, this kind of leads the band, because this is what is always the holdup, right? This is the log jam, this is the rail car that's up front. And without getting clarity and confidence from the owning member of the business to say, hey, I know what I'm doing, and because of that, I'm willing to announce it, I'm willing to provide a timeline, I'm willing to provide you clarity, then that lets everyone else move forward. So we're going to get into a little bit of this thing. Go ahead. So I just call it the what. Steve's going to get up here and talk about the how. I have my little laser pointer. I think that these 1, 2, 3, 4 points are really what this is all about, this part of the process. And I always start with clarity and confidence. Anyone here play sports? Yeah? I'm sure everyone, these emotional things burn in our brain. If you can just maybe close your eyes, keep them open, whatever, think back to whatever sport that you loved playing and go back to like the early days, like the super early days. I was a basketball player. All of a sudden you catch the ball in the game and go, oh no, now what do I do? So the next time I'm ready to go and pop open and catch the ball, guess what I'm thinking about? Oh no, I don't know what to do. I might not be able to dribble right, let alone dribble left. If I get it, who am I going to pass it to? So the more aggressive, more confident kids, if you watch kids play sports, whether they're talented or not is irrelevant. If they're more confident, they're more aggressive, and then everyone, not only do they get the ball, but everyone passes them the ball, right? I don't know what to do with it. Here, give it to her, give it to him, right? If we sat down for that exam, if you're not a sports player, everyone remembers, being in school and you sit down for the exam, you study, and all of a sudden the first question is like, oh my gosh, I have no idea what this is. What happens? Anxiety up, brain goes down, and then all of a sudden you say, I have no idea, like blank, everything goes blank, right? So everyone's got their rendition. It could be your biggest customer called yesterday and starts complaining about X, Y, and Z, and then your wife calls next and says, hey, hon, about dinner tonight. You're like, no way, I'm not talking about this now, right? So we all know, to Henry's point, when anxiety goes up, I'll use the word panic. I tell my kids, don't panic, because your brain just shuts off when that happens. Well, a lot of this lack of clarity causes anxiety, and it starts with you. If you're the predominant member of the business saying, listen, I need clarity of my situation, Because if I have clarity, then I'm going to have confidence. And if I have confidence because I know what I'm doing, now I'm a great leader, right? In the military, we look up to whoever those great leaders are. And they're not, are any of those people thought of as incompetent? No. Are any of them thought of as nervous Nellies? No. You know, if the general's anxious, guess what the troops are going to be? So, I mean, it makes complete sense. We just don't think of it this way. But this is a hard thing to do, mostly because people don't want to face, whether it be age or tenure or the fact that, hey, I still think in my head that this is going to go on for a while longer, whatever it might be. And then because of that, we start to ask questions. You know, do I need to sell this thing at all? Or someday I'm not going to be here? I mean, that'll happen. I mean, everything will work out, right? If I sell it, what number do I need to get? Can I gift it? Lots of parents say, hey, I love my children. It would be awesome if I could gift this. You know, I'm a fan of skin in the game, by the way, self-admitted. But if you want to gift a piece, it could be a combo. You don't have to gift all of it. You know, do I have the money to retire? When everyone sells their business, they usually think of what I call the check. And the check is whatever you sell that business for, whether it's to your children, an outside party, whatever it is. But let's say you sell to your children. That check amount is usually in your head because you looked at some industry publication. It could be you have a friend at the country club that's in a similar type business. Maybe an accountant or whoever your advisor is saying, here's what the business is worth. But at the end of the day, that business is worth one number, and that number is whatever the willing buyer is willing to pay for it. And you find that out real quick, right? But even if you get the check, here's the deal. You don't really care about the check, right? Getting $1 million, getting $10 million, getting whatever it is, really what you care about is how do I replace my paycheck? How do I turn that check into cash flow? Because by default of you being a smaller business owner, you probably don't have a pension plan from General Electric or whatever that's going to give you $8,000 a month for the rest of your life. You know, you don't have all these built-in huge benefits, so you have to create that cash flow. So is it going to work is really the question. You know, the reward, I call it. You deserve something. You know, in my mind, I talk about I'm 47. I've been at this for 23 years. I own the business here. What's that transition plan look like? We're talking a lot about this now. But I have children, 15, 12, 10. So my wife will say things like, Ian, it doesn't matter whether you need the money or not. You put your blood, sweat, and tears into this thing. You need to get something out of it. Don't just give it to them, even if you wanted to give it to them. And I think that there's a lot of us that feel that way, right? We put a lot of our life into this business to get where we've gotten. And then lastly, some of us are charitable, right? Most of us are charitable. You know, I would love to be able to give, but if I'm not okay myself because I don't have the money to retire, how do I even think about giving? But without having the clarity, figuring out how much I need in a paycheck, the reward, and then the charitable giving plan, I don't know if any of this is going to work, but it'll work out, right? I don't know about you, but I can envision, there's always at a low point in your life, right? You come home, break your parents the news, your mom comes up to you, puts her arm around you and says, it's okay, honey. It'll all work out. It will work out. Is it going to work out like you wanted it to work out? I mean, listen, ramen noodles will sustain you. I don't want to be eating ramen noodles, though, right? All right. Next slide, please. So, the when. And the answer is probably yesterday, but we can talk about today. So here's a question I like to ask my clients. If you know you are certain to have a problem in the future, when would you want to know about it? And I would suggest that right now is the only correct answer to that. So, do you know you're going to have a problem, everyone? No, we don't know. But do you know you're not going to have a problem? Right? I was reading, there's a guy that's put a system together in my business, this planning system. And he publicized something that he's probably in his 80s at this point. And he said, you know, it's funny how we all talk about financial planning, but how do you put a plan in place for a pandemic, the aftermath of the COVID supply problems, ultra high inflation that we haven't seen in 40 years, and we all know, we watch the news, right? So we don't know we're going to have a problem, but we don't know that we're not either. And I would just like to give everyone the confidence that you know something. And of course, it's not going to be perfect, but at least you have an idea. All right. Next slide. So we're going to get into what we're going to call not so perfect scenarios, and then we're going to talk about perfect scenarios. And these are just some. These come in all varieties. As I was going through this, I'm thinking of calls I've gotten as recently as yesterday, as a matter of fact, let alone last week and the week before that, of business owners and saying if it's good or if it's not good. This is probably the most not so perfect. Planning isn't perfectly done, or maybe it is in your mind, but you don't know your number. A health scare, right? I feel something, it's no big deal, right? Especially for us men in the room, we don't go to the doctor unless our arm falls off. So all of a sudden you hear something, or maybe it's even worse than that, maybe it's an abrupt passing. That definitely puts the wheels into motion of we need a transition plan, obviously. But that scramble, and Henry touched on this earlier, isn't the perfect way to do this, because with the luxury of time, we can make lots of choices. It's not good for you, it's not good for your children, and it's not good for the business. If you have no announced plan because you're just unsure, right, that lack of clarity, lack of confidence as to when you will slow down, let alone retire, let alone sell the business, you can't be a great leader. I would argue that you just can't be, because everyone's always wondering the what, the when, the how, and that doesn't go away. So you have a lot of troops that are below you that are looking to you for leadership, and it's always, well, we'll talk about it, we'll get to it, maybe next week, we'll set a meeting, let's talk with my advisor, I have to call my accountant, whatever it might be. But we want to provide the answers to these questions and get the anxiety down so that our team can execute, so our company thrives, right? Your spouse probably has a lot of input on this, maybe worried about you, maybe worried about us, right? Are we going to be okay? Am I going to be okay if something happens to you, right? We don't script it up, it just happens. Children and their spouses, right? So it's not only your children that are in the business, but then it's their spouses who are kind of sitting on their shoulder, or little comments here and there, right? Are we ever going to be owners? When can we kind of move our life on with some certainty to know? And it's always a lot more crystal clear to the spouses, I find, than it is to the person in the business. It's interesting how that goes, right? If so, how much, when? How am I supposed to make these decisions with all these unknowns? How do we move our life forward? What does this breed? Anxiety, stress, sometimes resentment, right? Unhealthy businesses and family dynamics. So the goal of what we try to accomplish, even with just this piece of trying to figure out the number, and Steve, you can move on to an example, because we learn by case studies the best, I think. We're trying to help the owners of the business, we're trying to help the rising gen of the business, and we are trying to help the business. Because then we'll get into the perfect scenario, and it's interesting to see what the focus of the business is when it changes. So this is a little snapshot of one of the various things that we do to clients to provide clarity. These are actually real people. Change the names to protect the innocent, of course. But Joe up here is 76. His wife is also 76. They have 3 kids, 2 of which actually work in the business. The third is partial owner of the business, but doesn't work in the business. So that's always an interesting dynamic, right? And of course they have children, but we'll stay here. Go ahead. This is the before, and then we'll get into what I painted a picture of after, and I'll go to that next. Joe, I'm going to forget the names because I know their real names. Joe is actually not working in the business anymore, although he owns the majority of the shares. But what they've agreed as a family that he will be on the board and collect a director's fee of $15,000 per year to do so. His wife also will be on the board because she's been around the business and worked in it at some point in the past, $15,000. From a tax perspective, which I won't get into, but just from an income perspective, et cetera, they've decided to pay Dad through a K-1 that's really the rent from the real estate. So Dad, you're not going to get distributions from the business in a K-1. We're basically going to pay rent. We're going to get that rent number to what it needs to be, and you're going to collect that number, and that's good for everyone. So that's kind of the setup. And theoretically, if nothing happened and we just played on, this is how things would go. From now, which is age 76, for the next 24 years, everyone in here lives till age 100 until they tell me differently. Joe also collects Social Security, by the way, as does his wife, a smaller amount because she didn't work all that long, and then she had worked back in the day for a pension and receives a pension. So if you scroll to the top there for me, Steve, $352,000 of income, right? Not a bad deal. And this is going to theoretically go on for a long time here. Liabilities, they have none. That's good. Savings and investments. So here comes the part of the story. Go all the way to the top. See this $200,000 number? We just use round numbers when we put the date in here, but that's how much liquid money this family has. So this isn't that atypical. Where is all the wealth? Real estate and the business. So if there's a hiccup somewhere, that could be problematic, obviously. So we can scroll down, but we're going to get into details there. And when you come over here to annual deposits, right, the way our system works is if there's a positive number at the top of that column, then that means that's how much they're saving. What this is telling you is they're not saving any money. So at 76 years old, they're living a great life, they're traveling, they're very charitable. That's where the bulk of this goes. That's what they want to do, and I appreciate that. Real estate-wise, they have a small mortgage on their house, which we don't need to get into. He owns the business building along in a partnership with his children. There's some other rental real estate down there, and if you scroll down, you're going to see a line item that says business value, and if you scroll to the right, we can see the values of all these things. The real estate values, up a hair please, Steve. There we go. 425 on his house value, less his 190 mortgage. This is the business building, 750, 150 on this piece of real estate down here, and you'll see that his piece of the equity in the ownership is $3 million. So as not to make this too complicated, he did a ton of planning. Super detailed guy, I mean, really smart guy, has many advisors, multiple accountants, one for the business, one for, he's got his estate planners and on and on and on, but he hasn't looked at this in a while. And I thought this was a good example because of the following. Although he has all these arrangements in place and what was supposed to happen, his children from the profit in the business were supposed to be buying him out year by year. At one point, one of his sons went to a Vistage Group meeting and got in his head that you should have at least $750,000 of cash in the bank as a business. And until you get there, I would not distribute any more money because, hey, what happens if there's an economic hiccup, a business problem, whatever? At the time, they had about $300,000. So if you look today, there's $2 million in the bank. But they, at some point in the past, because Dad yielded a little bit, said, okay, no problem, I get it, you don't feel comfortable, I'll pause it, but they never got back to restarting it. So the share buyout stopped. This is years ago. So now he's in a situation where he's going back to his children, and they don't really want to hear it. Interesting, right? Now, you might say my children would never do that to me. I mean, this wasn't a verbal or a handshake. This was a contract. They had a full buy-sell. It's very detailedly laid out. It just didn't happen. So now Mom, who is Joe's spouse over here, is saying, hey, hon, the kids aren't doing what the kids are supposed to do. He doesn't want to ruffle feathers because it's been a sticky conversation and he doesn't like to have an adversarial relationship with his children. And Mom says, I don't really care. I'll have the conversation with them. Hey, hon, like, why don't we solve this a different way? So at the end of the day, there's a little comment box off that if you want a little bit of detail about this. The other comment box off the $3 million, Steve. You know, valuation in 2020 was $5.4 million. There's 870 shares. Here's the share. And at the end of the day, if you click in that box, Steve, 3 million 80. Actually, click in the box. Yeah, he's got 57% of the company he still owns. The other 43% was bought out. What I'm having a conversation with them about is, listen, if it works and you don't get any of this value, it just doesn't happen. Fine, you might be okay with that. You may not. You may be. But guess what? By the numbers, it's going to work. But guess what? What happens if there's an event that happens and you don't have enough? Now all of a sudden, this isn't going to work. So if we get over to the income sheet here, this column here, I'll just shortcut this thing for purpose of presentation. As long as this number here doesn't go to zero, they have enough liquid money to live. And what that means is they haven't sold any of the real estate because the equity's in the real estate. They're continuing to get that K1 from the real estate. They're continuing to get the director's fees, et cetera. And because they pretty much spend everything that comes in and goes out, you know, plus a little bit because inflation's going to push that up there, they're not in a problem. They don't have a lot of excess. I mean, this is at age 100. They still have $500,000 liquid, but the real estate goes to the kids and the business would go to the kids. Make sense? So I raised my hand and I said, Joe, what if something happens? And now I'm going to show you how we tweak this model. Go back to income, Steve. Joe, what happens if you pass away? And he's 76. He's not 96. I get it, but it can happen. He's had some health scares. Well, he said, Ian, the director's fee. I said, would that still happen? You're not here to be a director. He said, absolutely not. Kill that. 0. You can just hit the, right? Would the K1 happen? He said, I don't know. I said, well, it's rental real estate income, right? He said, yeah, it probably would. I said, what happens if your kids sell the business? Where does that leave your wife? He said, good point, no more rent. I said, listen, I'm not a genius, but I can tell you if the business is, or the real estate that the business lives in is valued at $750,000 and you're collecting $275 of income per year, that might be okay accounting-wise and IRS-wise and income-wise for you, but listen, that sounds like a really high rent in Delaware where you are. So I would guess that probably is even if you could bring another tenant in, you're not going to get $275, right? So why don't we kill that and we'll just sell off the business building because that's likely what would happen. Director's fee down here for his wife. If he's not there, they're going to say, hey, mom, you might be out of business, especially if we sold it. Done. And then you can just take out her Social Security down the bottom there because she would get an in-between number, but let's just assume she gets his, right? So all of a sudden, scroll up, please. $38,000. You went from $300 and change thousand to $38,000 of income. But Ian, he says, we have a plan for this. Partly what we have a plan for is, go to the Life Events tab, is that there is a $1 million life insurance policy, permanent policy, so it doesn't matter when, that he would get, that she would get, right? I die, wife gets $1 million. So put a 0 in that box, please. There's another one for $300,000, which was a partnership agreement thing that they had. Then over here, I just did the math and said, what happens if they were to sell the real estate? They have a piece of the real estate because it's owned partly by the kids, but this is the part that they would get if they sold both pieces of real estate, both where the business lives and where the rental real estate is, 0 and 0, right? So now what's happened is the income's gone, but now they're going to get these lump sums. So if you were to take a look at, what's going on there, what's the total there? $2 million? Sound good? So Ian, I got a lump sum. I might be okay. Let's go over this income sheet here. You got to go over and you got to go into the lip tab and put their, you have to jack that up over here. So over here, when Dave alive, all these things happen. When you come over here, you just have to neg that out, Steve, and go put the minus $300,000. Right? Go to the income sheet here. What's your wife going to spend? Actually, I'm sorry, the other 300,000 positive, not minus. That's savings. You got the negative. Right? Red's not good, by the way. Even though they would get this, okay, well, listen, Joyce would spend less, right? Go to LIP, right? Go to that LIP. Make it, okay, how much are you going to spend? $200,000. Go in that box there. Okay, now you added in. Okay, there, that was a 300. Sorry, he didn't have a box clicked. So boom, age 83, done. Go to the lip tab again. Make it, 250. I said to his wife, would you still want to give charitably? Yes. Would you still want to live the way you live? Yes. I mean, obviously some things would change, but this thing isn't going to age 100, that's for sure. You can keep on dropping that number and dropping that number. And why? In this case, the material needle mover was when you have $275 of real estate income, and in exchange for that, you just get the value of the real estate, your ownership piece, net of cost, et cetera, 500 grand. That's 2 years of income in your shot, right? So they said, Ian, we should probably do something about this. I said, yeah, I would highly suggest you do. So that led to a conversation with some other advisors. Hit the Word document there. Which led to a letter that we helped the client craft to his children that said, look, here's the deal. Based on the most recent valuation, the value of the remaining shares that I own is $3.35 million, and the company owns, which we already talked about, a $1 million policy. We propose that the difference between what the insurance will pay and the value of 2.35 will be paid out as follows. And now we're going to the children, we're having a very constructive conversation and saying, hey, this is what we believe should happen here. And it's not mom saying, hey, this is unfair without the facts. It's not dad saying, look, you agreed to this, right? Because that's obviously been an adversarial thing. We're kind of restarting the whole thing and we're going into it, right? Now, there were some other things because Henry did bring up perks. The last thing I'll mention, if you go back to that, in addition to the income on the K1, he also put in place what's called an HRA, which is like a $30,000 long-term care insurance premium payer from the company, right? So it's for healthcare and things like that. They get some car things like, so we took care of all the perks. So I'm not going to get into that here, but this was something that we helped them through, and then he can present this to the children, and they can talk about this as a family. But there's been lots of conversation, Sally, Henry, Matt, and crew. Does that make sense?
Will you be in the room when he present? Are you going to be part of the presentation or not?
We talked a little bit about that, and he said, I think we got it. I think this is like a family thing at this point. We've had tons of conversation and tons of revisions, and he had some paragraphs in there about if this and if that, and we're, hey, what do we call him, Joe? Joe, I think we probably should not get into like what if and what if. Like, let's just stick with, he said, I think you're right. So at the very bottom, I think this is really interesting, and this is something we helped at the very, very bottom, this last paragraph. After consulting with our advisory team, we think that the structure outlined above is the best interest of the company, right, as it achieves the appropriate balance of ensuring the company's continued health, providing for our financial security for the remainder of our lives. So it's not about them. This is really about the company if you're the G that's going to be taking over the company. Because if the company dies, we're all out. You know, part of these plans, by the way, are installment payouts over time. It's very rare that the selling gen gets a lump sum and just walks, or that the buying gen is able to go to the bank and then go borrow that money. Well, I'm not going to steal Steve's thunder, but my point is, you know, we know about these different structures. You know, it's oftentimes that the business has to be able to afford this, and that is a focus. So this is really a three-ring deal here. All right, so let's go back to the slideshow. Let's talk about some perfect scenarios. Any questions? I'm just thinking why he's bringing this up. And the not so perfect, got a call yesterday. Husband was sick for a little while, was getting better, dropped dead. Kids thought that they were going to get the business. He didn't tell them that mom's getting the business. Mom never worked in the business until when dad got sick. And when I spoke with her yesterday, she was telling me, Ian, like, I said, did you ever work in the business too? Yeah. I said, what did you do? He said, well, you know, when he was getting sick, we talked about some things, like I know how to run payroll. So, you know, needless to say, there's going to be lots of processing, conversation, and, you know, lots of different things we need to talk about. All right. So more perfect scenarios would be as follows. The selling gen has enough, right? By virtue of our process, we show that we can convert that lump sum into a paycheck. And not only do they have enough, they know it. Here comes the confidence. Here comes the clarity, right? Has diversified assets outside of the business. Now, this may not be an option for some of you because you're into it. But in the ideal world, you know, the business, it's the best rate of return on my capital. You know, I mean, listen, I founded this business and I agree. But I would highly encourage, if you have the opportunity, to diversify outside of the business, just so that you don't have, you know, a one-trick pony here. In this case, I would love to see it, and especially for the rising gen folks, you know, save money outside. And if you like the stock market, great. If it's real estate, great. If it's other businesses, great. That he or she can decide to sell or gift. You know why? Because they don't need the money. I mean, talk about a position of power. We don't need the money, period. And because of that, we can decide to do whatever we want. How good would that feel? A clear plan has been laid out for them and their children with timelines. And I would suggest that that's probably the operative of that sentence. You know, we'll get to it next week, next month. I mean, all this is great up here, but if you don't actually put your line in the sand and say, here is the date, then everybody's always going to be wondering. The buying gen is clear on the other side of the coin, on the plans of the selling gen, so they can prepare. This certainty and confidence allows for strong business continuity and a healthier family dynamic. You know, we're going to get into this example, and the outcome of this, I thought this was interesting because I was talking with some of this client's advisors that we're going to show you the example of. And the conversation, as we got off, I said to Steve, you know what's really cool about this? The focus of the conversation wasn't about what's going to happen, what if this, what if that. Because all of this was buttoned up and taken care of, now, and not all the ownership has been transferred, by the way, but the conversation was about how can we scale? This is the best year we ever had, and we have all these plans in place, and now we have management, and we're going to do a search for this employee. We didn't even talk about this. When you're focused on this, you can't be focused on all these things. So I think it's a focus issue, which will definitely help the rising gen, right? We want to be focused on the right thing about how to grow the business, not on I'm worried about or what if, et cetera. I'm sorry, do you have a question, or are you just rubbing your eye? I thought you raised your hand. I'm sorry. Got it. All right, so let me just rip through this. I'll spend much less time here. This is a more perfect scenario. Dad is 63, mom is 60, two kids that are younger. They are now coming into the business, and I just got a report yesterday that they actually did gift about 49% of the business yesterday. So that we were really happy to hear that, because these folks are very thoughtful and very methodical, and they don't move quickly. All right, Dad's making $143. There's a rental property income here. Then these are two business properties here, and you know he's got some gas royalties because he was part of a hunting camp out in Central PA way back when, and he's collecting there. And Mom had a charitable remainder trust that they don't touch the principal because that goes to charity, but they do get income from it, and that's going to go for their lifetime. His Social Security will start at his age 67. Once again, he's 63. There's a loan repayment that they put money into the business. You know, there's a Medicaid annuity that Mom had that when she passed away and had given the business, et cetera. There's a loan repayment from the company that they had loaned money to. So we all know it's like being a business owner gets kind of complicated sometimes, right? But they have about $500,000 coming in. Boom. No liabilities. They're in great shape. Investments. This is the difference between the prior example and this, right? They have $7 million of liquid stuff. How? pretty good savers. They saved cash. They still have it. Here's his boat. You want me to throw that on there? You know, this is a brokerage account that we work with, $5 million that, you know, they just saved and invested over the course of years and built equity, built net worth outside of the business is the point of the story. Kind of scroll down here, retirement plans, da-da-da. So $7 million is the answer, right? Real estate, just click over there, quick, Steve. You know, you come over here, we just can look at the totals. No debt, $7 million of real estate, where they live. They got a couple different investment properties. They have some business properties, you know, et cetera. And I'm sorry, in that 6.9 is their end of what the business is worth. So you come over and look at their sheet here, income sheet. Got it, subliminal. Scroll down. Remember that gray column's the operative. That's when they run out of their liquid money, meaning they didn't even yet touch the business value. They didn't even yet touch the equity in the real estate. They have $23 million. Look what's happening. It's not going down. What's it doing? It's going up. Great scenario, right? I think we all aspire to say, if I could just live off the interest from my money, right? What happens if not only can you live off that, but then it grows over the course of time because the pile's so large. So these people, once again, are in the driver's seat. They have complete clarity. They have no worries about this at all. And they could sit there and say, do I sell? Do I gift? What do we want to talk about today? We're going to bring in an outside board. We're going to. And it's a much, much more logical conversation. Right? Back to the slides. All right. Next one. That is the next one? All right, cool. So I'm going to transition over to Steve, but before I depart here, does anyone have any questions? Or I'm sorry, back to Henry, excuse me. Anyone have any questions? Make sense? Listen, this is not a commercial for I'm Wealth Partners. Whether it's with your person, if they're capable, great. If you would like our help, great. Please, just sit down and go through the number. And here's what I love about this. This is the last thought I'll put in your head. As the owning gen of the business, or the majority owning gen, there's zero risk to do it. Because many of these other things that you would have conversations with accountants about, or estate planning or whatever, you have to kind of involve your children. You could do this as a covert mission, and they don't even know you're doing it. And if you like the answers, great. That could set off another process that says, great, now I know. Or maybe you don't like the answers. Wow, we have some work to do. We call it course correcting. But there is no risk, zero, right? No one even needs to know. It's maybe you and or your spouse, right? Thank you, guys. Would you like this?
No. I'm dangerous with that.
Is that technology?
That's technology. Huh?
Excuse me.
You're back in presentation mode.
Well, the next issue here is what's my next chapter going to look like? Now, I'm going to use Charlie Hoover here. Charlie was G2, right?
Yeah.
Worked his whole life, loved it. Yeah. Loved being, the president, the owner, single owner, right, for most of the time. Yeah. And so all of a sudden his kids come along and they agree on how to transfer. So what he's going to do? Well, I think it's pretty important for Charlie to tell the next generation what they're going to do. It's their business, right? Now again, they're in control, but I think we need to decide, am I going to work a lot or not? Some people, they just close the book and they go to Florida or whatever. But, you're going to have an office. We have a client that is 97, 98. He still has an office and a secretary. Drives the next generation crazy. He has kept control of the whole deal. He's on the board. So I'm a firm believer in that if you own the business, you can make whatever decisions you want to make. Now, if you make them without consulting the next generation, it's probably not a good plan. Because Ruben, you need Jonathan to carry forward, right? Not just for the money, but because of the business. You love the business. And then what's the timetable? I have a client and friend who says, oh, I got a rolling 5-year plan that just kind of keeps rolling forward. 5 years, yeah.
drives the kids nuts.
Yeah. So part of the senior generation's responsibility is to develop the number and the confidence. A lot of our clients are very charitable, and an important part of their next generation work. I mean, many of us will live 25 years after the business is transferred. So the charitable interests are very high. So what Ian is talking about here, I think, is very important. But also, what is your next chapter? I think you need to be as clear as you can about that. So the third principle that we think is important is that all family members count. Now, sometimes you get a call from people and they say, well, we want your help to transition, and we say, well, okay, we'd like to meet with you and your wife. Oh, I don't want my wife in this. She's never been involved in this, and I don't want her involved now. We learned the hard way that if you don't include spouses, it's not going to go, I mean, spouses can be a problem, right? Any of us can be a problem. But we found, as Ian already mentioned, is that the spouses know what's going on. And they're willing to, well, maybe I should say maybe the female spouses are willing to speak the truth more than the men. I mean, the women will say, well, the emperor has no clothing here. And so we have found spouses to be very important. We are working with a client now out of state that hired the best transition company in their industry to help them with their transition. Hired by the G4. It took maybe a year. Very technically oriented transition, and spouses were not involved at all. And they paid a lot of money, and they bought a lot of life insurance during that process. And then they called us and said, this isn't working. So the first thing Sally says is, oh, well, we need the spouses involved. And they said, oh, well, yeah, we're not quite sure about that. But after one meeting, they were delighted. Now, siblings. Reuben, your other sons probably are not interested in owning, but you don't know yet, right? Everything could change, but they're going to have a lot of interest in Jonathan's being an owner. And whether or not you're treated fairly, and whether or not the business transaction is going to allow your estate to be fair to them. So it's really important that we think all the siblings are involved in some measure. Now, every business is different in how you handle that. But this is very key. I mean, it's a family business, right? I mean, so why wouldn't spouses be involved?
And again, it doesn't mean they have decision making, but to have a voice into and to understand the process. Very important.
Well, I want to talk a little bit about advisors. Most advisors, like doctors, are trained to work independently, right? You go to your doctor, he's going to say, I have responsibility for your health. I'm going to tell you what to do. Attorneys, accountants, they're trained to actually work in silos. And many family businesses, their most trusted advisor is their accountant. Why is that? Well, they have to meet with them once a year. They have to. They don't want to, but they have to. So often there is a kind of a bias against involving too many advisors because it's expensive. Well, let me tell you how expensive it is not to involve them. Now, you want well-educated people with deep experience, but I haven't met an accountant who doesn't feel like he's a really smart family business transition person. Actually, I had one last month actually referred somebody to us and said, I'm not good at this. But because accountants work with family businesses all the time, right? 90% of all businesses are about 90% are all family businesses. So yeah, they have a lot of experience. We think it's important to have advisors who are excellent teachers, right? Because a lot of this is educating your family around the financial and legal parts of the business. And we believe that they need a high level of emotional maturity, that they can listen carefully to the goals of both generations, and that they're clear about their limitations. Okay, that's part of emotional maturity, to know what my limits are, what I'm good at and what I'm not. And they're also willing to challenge peers so that you can get the best for you. So I'd like to ask Steve to come front now and talk about kind of how the business transfer methodology and how to think about this. Now, Steve's been doing this work for a long time. He's with Kreischer Miller, and they've been partners for a long time with us. And I'd like him to give you a similar kind of window into his important role in this. Steve?
Thank you, Henry and Ian, for just teeing this up a little bit here. So I guess going back to this slide, well, we're going to pass that. So I'm just going to cover a little bit at a very high level about the overview of the ownership transition process, right? And so what we talked about, what Henry and Ian were talking about, is some of the work that's done on that front end there. We tend to get a little heavier involved in sort of the structuring of the items, what techniques can be used, evaluating how it can impact the company. But I will tell you, one of the biggest challenges we see is that we have people come in and have come into our office and ask us, hey, I'm ready to transition the business. What do I do? Do I gift it? Do I sell it? And the biggest thing we have to do is stop and hold up, because it's so critically important that on the front end, that this front end work is done. Without it, you end up going down this rabbit hole of options about what to do with the business. And so without understanding what the role, the clarity is with the goals of both the senior generation and the next generation, and understanding what the cash flow needs are of that senior generation, you really have to do that work first. So I'm going to spend just a few minutes on some of the common structures and techniques, and then just go through a little bit of an illustration about what are the different considerations to be thinking about in the process here. So this is just an illustration of just very common transfer methods and structures that businesses look at, right? And they each come with their own set of reasons as to why you may use one technique over the other. Family businesses actually have the most amount of options available to them. And so that is one great news. Bad news is sometimes options can be both good, but when there's a lot of them, it can be a little overwhelming. So one of the ways to go through and pare down on that is to understand what are some of the needs. Each of these have their own set of cash flow implications. Each of them have their own set of risk and level of complexity related to them, and some are a lot more tax efficient than others, both for the sellers of the business, but as well as for the company. So for instance, family gifts work really well if you don't need cash flow, right? Because at this point, I'm just transitioning ownership of the company, but I'm not getting anything in return. It's incredibly tax efficient, right? Right now, estate and gift levels are up around that $25 million level. So you can give, between a married couple, give $25 million of value. There's no tax to the the donor, and there's no tax for the recipient.
No federal tax.
Right, no federal, right. Pennsylvania doesn't have that if you're in PA. And it's easy to do. But as Ian illustrated, right, when you looked at some of the models, most business owners, a majority of their assets are tied up in the value of the business and don't always have the liquidity. And a lot of that depends upon how mature the business is, right? How far along they are, how much they've been able to extract value and build up some assets on the personal side that will impact it. So family gifts can work if you don't need money and you want some high level of some tax efficiency, right? We also have a variety of, what is that, deferred? Other types of transactions would be seller-held notes, sometimes bank notes, other types of payments that can come in as well. So we really need to understand if you need cash flow, we might be looking at a different set of options here. And depending upon, they each have some trade-offs in terms of the types of risks that they present, both to the company and to the owners as well.
A seller held note of your will forgives the debt. How does that affect tax?
Yeah. So if you have a note that then is if it's a forgiveness of debt, then that's typically an income for the person that it's being forgiven of. What we will often see is seller held notes that will transition down to, and I think you're referring to like the self-canceling. I know Henry and I were talking a little bit about it. We've seen something called a self-canceling indebtedness note. I think a SKIN is often the acronym that's utilized for that. What we typically more often will see in a lot of these that works is just a seller held note where the company is becoming the mechanism for making the payments, and then through the will process, if there's still a balance left, that'll often transition down to the heirs, and then they can just settle it themselves that way. That's a little bit more. So, and because the company often becomes the mechanism for making any of these types of payments, this is the piece that we need to model in, which is just understanding the impact about how much the company can afford, right? Because it's important to know what the commitment is from a cash flow perspective, what impact it has on the business from a leverage perspective, and what impact it may have on banking covenants, right? Keep in mind, banks are often the biggest source of capital, the primary source of capital for most private businesses, right? They don't have the ability to go out and raise funds typically from other types of debt markets the way a public company may be able to do that. So they're often looking at some level of bank financing in place. And so they want to understand, banks are also a partner that need to be involved in some of these conversations because they need to understand the impact that it's going to have on the company. And the same thing with the ties into the leverage component there. So I'm just walking through again, this is just a draft illustration, but some of the analysis that we will take into play is, well, what is the impact on the company currently? So we have a situation where you may have a balance sheet currently as is. What do we do? What happens to it after we layer on a transaction? What does it look like after? And what we're looking to do is focus on keeping an eye on some of these key metrics about the impact that the transaction has on the business itself. Looking at its liquidity, and also a big one, looking at the leverage component, because that is going to be important to know and understand. The cash flows, though, that's usually where the rubber meets the road in terms of needing to understand, well, can I afford this? What is the impact? What is it going to look like to the company currently if we layer in this type of transaction, right? So it's just doing some modeling about substitution costs that might be in play. It's looking at what types of debt obligations we're going to be able to pay, and looking at it from an after tax basis as well. And again, keeping an eye on some of these ratios that might be important from a lending perspective. For those of you that may carry any debt with any type of bank, you'll know that a few things that they will look at is some things like a debt to equity or a debt service coverage ratio. So that's an ability of the company to meet its obligations. The other piece about it, though, and the big part about it is, can we afford this transaction on a going forward basis, right? Because we're all assuming some level of risk. If you're the senior generation that's exiting the business and taking on some level of note payable obligations, you're relying, right, on that next generation to come in, run the business, and continue to generate the cash flows so that they can meet those obligations. So there's some credit risk there for that senior generation, but for the next generation that's now coming in and has the ownership in the business, now they have this obligation. And as stockholders of the company, you are behind the debt holders of an organization, right? Like, debt holders get paid first before the equity holders. And sometimes that's a big misunderstanding, or a piece that's often missed by that next generation coming up. When you're the owner of the business, you ride the highs and you also ride the lows in that instance. And if you do have bank financing in place, like they take a primary position above that of any of the internal holders, right? So some of the things we'll put together is financial projections, and it's really important to stress test those assumptions. That's something we see a lot, is that everybody assumes, oh, this year is just going to repeat again in perpetuity forever. But what if we have a blip in the road, right? So it's important to run through and stress test some of those assumptions with not just rose-colored business is going to continue or it's going to, increase in perpetuity. Yes, that's important to do, but we also need to be able to have an ability to model in, well, what happens if there's a decline over a period of time? Much like what Ian does with their financial planning that they were running, those scenarios. And then just keeping an eye out on some of the banking covenant considerations. So here's just a sample of what an analysis might look like. So we're running out the cash flow modeling from the date of the transaction all the way out through till the final payments are made. And in this case, it's like a 10-year structure, so we run it out at least 11 years and give us some ability, I think this got formatted, this is where we can do some of the stress testing. So plug in some growth or decline assumptions that run through and see what it yields down at the bottom. And know, hey, do we have enough margin here at the end of the day to ride out any other little blips? And it's important to put in here some of the working capital or CapEx expenditures if you're in that kind of business that requires that, because all of the profits of a company aren't always available just to distribute out and make the payments, right? In a lot of businesses, and especially we've seen it in more recent times, any company that's carrying inventory is either there's a longer lead time on getting the inventory in the door, and their customers are paying them a little bit slower. And sometimes I've been seeing a lot of companies that started stocking up on inventory because when they could get it, they got it and brought it in. And so that required a certain level of cash to reinvest back into the business for that working capital piece. And then down below, again, just modeling in if there are some important metrics, we need to know where and when we might have some blips along the way. So in this particular example, you can see that this got cut off, but there's a debt service coverage ratio number, And typically we'll see banks wanting that number anywhere between a 1.1 to a 1.3 times number. So we're watching it, we're monitoring it, and then we got a period here. And what is causing that to happen? It's blanked out by this this watermark, but you'll see there is this particular situation had a debt payment that was coming due, that had a balloon payment that was due and owed. So unless that gets refinanced, that was going to cause a little bit of a blip in the road. And this is important to go through with the with your lenders as well. So we're modeling in the substitution costs, the structure, taking into account the tax impact as well. Any questions on that? I know I'm going quick. I was trying to keep us on some timetable here. So the last piece I just wanted to go over is just what are some of the common pitfalls that I know from my experience. I've seen all of these come up over the years of doing this, right? And it dovetails into some of the items that I think Henry had pointed out as well. So one of the big things is structuring a plan that focuses solely on, it's just a myopic approach, right? It's solely focused on just the financial needs of that generation is exiting. And we had a situation, I know I had one where we were not involved in the structuring of the transaction. They came on as a client after one had already been put in place. And when we were breaking it down, the structure was to a level that it was starting to bankrupt the company, because the number that was used was just solely for what the parents needed from a retirement perspective. And it was a distribution business that wasn't particularly like niche, so their margins were a little bit on the tighter side. So over the years, the parents had struggled to build up some wealth outside of the value of the business. Well, they layered in this transaction, and the kids were borrowing money from their 401k to lend it back into the company to then distribute it out and give it back to the parents. So we had to take a time out and had a conversation with both the parents and the children to say, like, look, there might be a better way. We restructured it a little bit to change just the characterization of how those payments were coming out, but also just having the parents know, hey, we're killing this goose here. Like, you're gonna get nothing if we don't do something in the near term. Another one that I mentioned is just modeling out only growth assumptions in those cash flows. Again, I think it's important that there's modeling in just some level of what if there's a decline and seeing what tolerances are built in, because we don't want to get it too tight. One that doesn't focus on that doesn't take into consideration any banking covenants, right? Again, we're just going to the bank after the fact and saying, oh, we did all of this, it's levered up the company, there's these commitments going out. Banks are also concerned because oftentimes that senior generation may have personal guarantees that are part of their collateral and comfort level, and oftentimes that next generation coming in does not have the level of assets that a bank can feel comfortable with, right? So we do want to be conscious of that, and there's rights in their agreements to call loans when some of these, if there's a change in ownership and so on. And so you want to be conscious of that, especially depending on what stage in the banking cycle we are in, right? Here's another one, just not leveraging the resources, tools, and experience of other advisors. I think collectively just having the insight from people that have done it from different angles, and this is oftentimes one of the biggest transactions, if not the biggest transaction of most business owners' lives. And so there's a lot at stake. And so, like what Henry's point was bringing up, there are costs involved, but I tell people you should view that more as an investment, right? And investments should bring a level of return to you, not just be an expense. The flexibility of timing and structure, right? There's give and takes in all of this that we do. If there's a number that somebody needs, we can always get to the number if we can name the terms. How long and how much over a period of time. So just having some flexibility with understanding what some of that give and take is. This is a really big one. Just underestimating the time it takes to think through these options and go through the analysis. We've had many people come up. I've had plenty of calls over the years where we get a call in September and hey, I'm ready to exit the business. What do I need to do? Okay, what's your time frame? Oh, I'm thinking in the next, by the end of the year, or I want to get out in the next 6 months, right? All that by not taking that time frame up front, all you do is lob off the options that become available to you. So the more time you have, the more options, the more levers you have to put in place. And this is pretty heavy stuff from a psychological perspective, right? Like there's the elements of some level of mortality and just separation from something that's been such a big part of people's lives that taking the time to really think through the options, what it means, what am I going to do after. This is not something you shove through in 2 months, quite frankly. You can. It's just often people walk away with not having everything that they would like. And then the last thing is, again, that not spending enough time on that front end portion. I mean, if there's anything I would say from where I sit that is a takeaway from what we're talking about today, it's doing a sufficient level of that upfront work, right? What are the goals and objectives that you're looking to achieve? How involved do you think you want to stay in the business? What is my number? How can I live comfortably on that end? So I think I got us in under that 10:30 mark.
Thank you.
Through some action. So
In ownership transition, we're really rebuilding the whole mountain. How it was done last generation, not likely how you're going to do it in the next generation. So you got to have a shared dream. It's where we're going. And then family employment expectations. And then what are we going to do with the profits? Capital allocation, big deal. We had a meeting on that 3 weeks ago. Are we going to have a board? Most of companies in this room need some sort of external accountability. And then we need obviously a buy-sell, and your accountants and attorneys, and we can help you work with that. But finally, you got 2 generations working together, okay, where it's not like this, but it's like this. Both generations entering into a conversation where they both win. We end up with a stronger family, more robust enterprises, and really, very importantly, a solid foundation for future generations. Okay? So, Sally?
So questions? Any questions, comments, observations about anything? Rod, and we're using this because we're taping it. For those who can't be here, if you don't mind speaking.
Sure. This has all been very interesting, and the thing that I'm personally struggling with is how do we handle this in subsequent generations when we have multiple owners with perhaps different numbers, different timelines, different next chapters, and probably different willingness to cooperate or sacrifice for the next generation. And what does that lead to in that next generation when there are differences between ownership?
Yeah, like in your case, you have 3 current owners, right? So instead of one number, you have 3 numbers, and you got a growing business, which will many times the business gets so big you can't buy it. There has to be a lot of gifting, and how do you balance all that out? We think you need an ongoing, strong advisory group that is working on that early, that is thinking about everybody's numbers, is thinking about the performance of the business, and also encouraging the next generation, the Alexes, to gain all the competence and confidence that they need to talk to their peers who will be owners in the next generation. That's a really critical issue.
Yeah, and I would add that generation, your generation, Alex, making sure that you guys are, it's not hopefully going to be an arranged marriage, but making sure that you guys are having those conversations because you're the next. But yeah, it's not a quick, this is a long marathon, very, very,
Well,
very,
it gets
very
more
challenging.
complicated as the business grows and the family grows, Ian.
And last thing, just from my perspective, I mean, figuring out what you want, right, and what you need, that's, because only you can answer that. It's kind of like when we were talking about estate planning, this gentleman said, hey, who decides the estate plan? It's whose estate plan it is. And each generation has to kind of figure that out in themselves, so at least you're solid on a piece of the puzzle. Because when you don't know what you want or what you need, your brain tells you it's got to be more. I need more, I need more. You may not, but your brain's always going to err on that side, if you know what I mean. So.
Well, Rod, there's no easy answer to this, but a company that we worked with 15 years ago had, 4, 5, or 6 cousins that were eligible. 3 of them stood up, 1 from each branch. And that was a tough discussion. Now, we had to help them with that because that's a discussion you don't want to have. But it's very important at that front end to have a truth-telling session about who wants to be partners with whom and pairing the tree. Like in our family business, there were 2 brothers who owned it. There were then 7 shareholders, and 2 of them bought the other 5 out. Painful stuff. So if you don't do it at the front end, you're probably going to do it somewhere, and it's going to cost you a lot more if you don't plan properly.
It's true separation of the mountains, though. Yeah. Anything else?
I do have one last comment. I think what I've learned as an advisor, all this math stuff, he's really good at it too. It's awesome. It's how you say it, because you only get one chance to present this stuff oftentimes. And I think that the value of a great advisor is going to help you craft the letter, is going to help you say, these are the words that I would suggest you use, or, maybe to the client, what are you thinking about saying to your children? Oh, no, we don't want to say that. Right? Because everyone focuses on the what, but they don't focus on how it's going to feel. So I think that's huge when you're speaking with your advisors. Like, let's talk about how we're going to go about this and let's get really clear on the verbiage.
So we want to make sure we honor your time. It's 10:30. I think a lot of us, we can hang around a little bit, but our next event is September 22. More of what we're talking about, we're going to hear from folks who either are currently in a multiple shareholder arrangement, or Matt Sullivan. Many of you know him. He's on our team as an advisor. He's actually an alumni. His family was part of our learning community for years. Dunmore, he's number 7 out of 9 children. He ended up leading the company for over 20 years. He was a shareholder with up to 19 siblings and the next generation. And he was accountable to the board. So Matt's going to be telling his perspectives from his own growing up and also as part of our team. And then Robbie and Karen Keim, they're G4s. They have a very interesting shareholder journey that they're going to be sharing, and we're going to be talking about boards. So we look forward to seeing you then, and thank you for coming, and also you're welcome to hang around.